Welcome to the second talk at Fenrir Association. I'm really happy that so many are here. Welcome to everybody in the room and welcome to everybody online as well. Very happy to see people there too. Tonight we're gonna welcome Luke John Murphy, who's gonna talk to us about the blood eagle ritual Viking Age, and it's gonna be very exciting. And I'm just gonna give the floor to Luke. So welcome, Luke.
Ja, tak Christina, og tak I alle for at komme. I'll stick with English. It will be torture of a different type for you to listen to my Danish for the next hour. So, I'm going to be talking to you tonight about the blood eagle. Now, this is something that you've probably all met in one form or another, possibly through your studies, through a saga or a poem, possibly through more modern Viking media, a video game or a film. So, in a nutshell, very briefly, it is a tortuous form of execution where the victim's back is opened up, their ribs are splayed out, and their internal organs are pulled out on display. Consider this a content warning. This is going to be a pretty grisly talk. My slides are fairly clinical. We've kept it quite anatomical, but nonetheless, we're going to be talking about some fairly unpleasant things, just so you're aware. So, spoilers alert as well for a few modern pieces of media. Has that worked? Yes, good. The blood eagle appears in spectacular, thank you. Blood eagle appears in TV shows and films like the Vikings TV show or Midsummer, this Swedish horror film that is somewhat inspired by Viking horror. And when I went looking for screenshots to show you in this talk, actually I stumbled across this in the Vikings fan wiki, which noted, sadly it's under trivia, but it did note that there is some dispute as to whether or not the blood eagle was ever actually a historical thing, or kind of was it something that's been misunderstood or even perhaps invented by medieval writers. And if any of you are interested in this topic more generally after the talk today, I can thoroughly recommend the classic debate between two giants of the field, Roberta Frank and Bjarne Einarsson, who went back and forth over a number of years, arguing in articles with each other about, well, yes, it really happened. No, it didn't. It's a complete fantasy. No, it really happened. Look at the words. And so on. It's actually really interesting to read. And so this kind of question has been seen as permanently unsettled for a long time. Did the blood eagle ever really happen? And I don't think we can answer that. That's not what I'm here to talk to you about tonight. So apologies for any false advertising here. I'm not going to ask, was the blood eagle ever really performed? Because I think there's another way we can come at this topic. We can instead ask, could the blood eagle ever have been performed? So instead of trying to just look at the same sources again and perform the same close readings and critical analyses of the words again, I want to look a little bit more broadly. I want to look at two sets of constraints within which any putative, alleged historical blood eagle would have had to occur. The anatomical constraints of the human body. Is it literally physically possible to do this to somebody or not? I mean, if it's not, that'll prove pretty definitively this thing was made up, right? Or at least was the exaggerated misunderstanding. I also want to look at the socio-cultural constraints because, I mean, one reason that so many people know the blood eagle is because it's an extreme case of kind of brutality, even by Viking Age standards, right? So how extreme was it? Because if it's a serious outlier, then maybe we can say, oh, those pesky medieval Christians were making things up to make the pagans look bad. Something we meet a lot in the study of medieval Icelandic sources, right? But before we get onto those things, I think we should probably talk about those sources. They are kind of important. So we have 9 written sources from the, the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries describing a blood eagle. Sadly, this doesn't mean we have evidence for 9 blood eagles. So these are our texts, these are our 9 sources. And you'll see then from the dating here that they span a fair range. The oldest of them is the poem Knútsdrapa, which is a skaldic verse, which was produced in the 1020s or 30s for an Anglo-Scandinavian king who'd basically just come over and kicked ass in England. And the poem celebrates his victories in England by harking back to earlier Scandinavian conquests of the area. And so the blood eagle isn't something that Knut, the guy whose the poem honours, is said to have done. It's something an earlier invasion allegedly did. So in fact, there isn't much of a kind of direct connection between any source and a putative blood eagle. There's at least a century between any event and any record of that event. So we're on shaky ground already. But again, studying the late Iron Age, the Viking Age, or pagan ritual or anything like that, this is standard practice for us. The Viking Age is a prehistoric time. They literally didn't write stuff down. So, oh, sorry, I'm looking at different slides here. I think that's one behind.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay, sorry. So as I said, we've got 9 sources, but they don't record 9 separate blood eagles. In fact, they only record 4 separate blood eagles. And the victims are all these powerful figures, powerful male figures, in fact. The slight outlier here is Brusi. So I'd imagine some of you have heard of Lingvi from the kind of the Volsunga saga cycle. Some of you might have heard of Halfdan Hauleger, who was a son of Harald the Halfagri. I doubt many of you have heard of Brusi because he never existed. He was a Jotun. So this is a very kind of mixed thing. It's not necessarily a straightforwardly historical activity that was done. It also appears in these, what we might call semi-fictional stories, Ormstalter. But what is it actually like? So you do your blood eagle, and our Old Norse texts more or less agree. They use 4 different verbs to describe how this was happened. A blood eagle, or a bloody eagle, or an eagle was carved or sliced or marked or cut into the back of the victim. And the Old Norse sources are all fairly kind of close in this. Sometimes they use different verbs, sometimes they make a proper noun out of blodorm, so capitalized in English. It's a real thing that people did and you're supposed to know what it was. But other times it's a bit vaguer. And this is backed up by our lone Latin source, so a chapter of Gesta de Norrønt, where we have the same accounts of the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok in northern England capturing a guy called Ella, or Hella, and doing a blood eagle to him. Now, what's interesting is that the Latin here says that they dorsum plaga aquilam figurante efficiobint. They just put the likeness of an eagle onto his back. There's no mention of kind of breaking open rib cages and pulling out organs. It is just the shape, the form, a picture of an eagle. And they salt the wound, and then he dies. There's no organ business at all. And looking a little bit more closely, actually, that's also the case in some of our Old Norse sources. There's what we might call a more superficial form of the blood eagle. But that's not the only form of the blood eagle we're dealing with. Some of the others, oh sorry, here's another example. So Knutstrapa is a skaldic verse, right? There's no room for detail here. We'll come back to Knutstrapa in more detail later. But apart from that, the others, well, they had plenty of room to say, oh yeah, ribs were broken and stuff was pulled out if they wanted to. The others, though, just say no. There was a blood eagle cut on his back, and he died. It's actually made pretty clear in the Ragnar saga. There is literally no space here. There's no wiggle room around, elliptic poetry that maybe doesn't tell the whole story. There's nothing body modification-wise going on. Other sources, though, Monogestalter, Ragnarsonathalter, these guys at the bottom here, they're a lot more invasive. So let's take Harald saga from Heimskringla. So Haralda, Einar goes to Halfdanar, and han lagði sverði á hjól hinn hrygin og reistrífin öll opn á lenda dró þar út lunginum. This is very explicit. He cuts all the way down the spine, along the ribs, down to the loins, that's these bits here, and pulls out the lungs through the holes. Again, there's no kind of room for ambiguity here. This is extremely detailed. We know exactly what's going on. And that's the same kind of description of this activity that we find in Orkneyinga saga, which granted has a close textual relationship to Harald saga, but also in the Ragnarsonathalter, Ormstalter, and Monogestalter. So we seem to be dealing with 2 traditions of the blood eagle. Right? We've got the superficial one with an eagle shape, followed by death. And then we've got a more invasive one, which may or may not include the carving of an eagle shape. And then we've got all the business with cutting down the back and pulling out ribs and bits of spine and organs, followed by death. So how do we kind of align these? Are they the same thing at all? So there's a few different possibilities that we might be dealing with here. Viking Age culture in this period, if there was a single Viking Age culture, which is the point of debate, was pretty varied, right? People are doing very different things depending on who they are, where they are, when they are in this, several century long period. So it's possible that these sources reflect a genuine historical variation in the practice of blood eagling people, if such a practice ever existed. Alternatively, and kind of a very popular position over the last few years has been that these more kind of in-depth, invasive accounts are exaggerations of or misunderstandings of the earlier, more superficial ones. So particularly the poetry, right? It can be quite elliptic, it can be quite hard to understand, there's not a lot of details. So maybe people are filling in the blanks for themselves, making it fun, making it exciting, making it bloody and sexy. That's possible too. And in fact, I mentioned earlier the debate between Frank and Emerson. This is Roberta Frank's position, that although it's possible that the blood eagle was carried out as we understand it, it was far more likely, it's being Ella's back here, was far more likely to have been lacerated by a real eagle. So Frank's position, Frank's observations have been very convincing to scholars in our field, I think for very good reason. She's been very sharp. She's noticed something that a lot of people didn't for many years. So reading the poem, aura here is the keyword. That's our eagle. And aura could be either the accusative or the dative of and it's understood by all of us essentially as the dative form. That is, in Old West Norse, the standard Old Icelandic or Norse that we learn, cut with an eagle. Now, the dative form can also be used to mean cut by an eagle, instrumental dative. But in Old West Norse, an instrumental dative requires a preposition. It requires the equivalent of the English word by. And that doesn't appear in the poem, so everybody went, right, fine, it means it was cut with an eagle. What Frank noted and proved by looking at other verses in this poem is that this isn't written in Old West Norse. This is written in Anglo-Scandinavian. So that kind of slightly hybrid dialect spoken in the British Isles by people from Scandinavia. And you know what they don't have? They don't have prepositions for their instrumental datives. So it is entirely possible that this text says this was cut by an eagle. And that was Frank's position. She argued it very well. I'm personally not very impressed by Bjarni Einarson's rebuttals. He seems to shift the goalposts a little, but I encourage you all to go and have a read for yourself and make up your own minds. And I'm in total agreement with Frank that that could mean cut by an eagle. Where I disagree with her is that it must mean cut by an eagle. The poem is ambiguous. Skaldic poetry, by definition, sought to be ambiguous and difficult and fun to puzzle out. So I actually suspect that our poet here, Sigvaldur, he was doing that deliberately. For Frank, what Frank thinks is going on here is that it's a beasts of battle motif. So there's a battle and we see the eagle and we see the wolf and we see the raven coming to feast on the dead. And yeah, that could absolutely be the case. We're getting an eagle feasting on Ella's back because he's dead, he's lying dead on the battlefield. But is it not also possible that Sigvaldur is playing with the ambiguity of, oh look, there is an eagle involved, both beasts of battle and blood eagle? I think that's very possible. So there's been two kind of groups of scholars here. Some saying, oh, it's all a misunderstanding, it never really happened, there is no historical basis for this, it's all been kind of made up and blown out of proportion. Alternatively, there's been some who have said, oh no, it definitely happened. And most of those have then gone on to say, oh, and it was a pagan ritual. We'll come back to that later. So now let's have a look at what we can add to this debate today. Could the blood eagle ever have been performed? Let's look at those constraints I noted earlier. And I want to start by looking at the anatomical constraints. And for here, actually, I'm not the expert in this section. I'm actually going to swap over to a script that my co-authors and I produced. I say and I, mostly I just read it through and went, yeah, that makes sense to me. And as you'll have noticed from their affiliations, they're not historians or historians of religion or archaeologists or historical anthropologists, they're medical doctors and anatomists. So this was a really fun interdisciplinary project to work on. So I'm going to switch over to the script. Hope this is okay. And there are going to be slides and stuff as well. And we'll come back to then socio-cultural stuff and me talking more randomly at you afterwards. So there are three major anatomical challenges that would have made it difficult to complete a blood eagle execution as we understand it, particularly while the victim remained alive. The first is the difficulty in rapidly removing the skin and muscles of the back. This would have been necessary because these obstruct the cutting and manipulation of the underlying ribs, which would need to be mobilized to allow the removal of the lungs and the formation of any wings. So as you've gathered, what we've done here is we've taken the kind of the full invasive blood eagle and gone, right, is that possible? And if that's not, we're going to drop features and work our way down until we get to stuff that is definitely possible, like just carving the shape of an eagle on someone's back, like a really aggressive tattoo artist. Okay. Second major challenge is the negative effects that opening the thoracic cavity, that's the kind of the hollow in the body here, in the torso, would have had on the integrity of major arteries of the body, and the negative interpleural pressures that keep the lungs inflated. We'll come back to interpleural pressures. Thirdly, the formation of eagle wings from the posterior rib cage and the mobilization of the lungs through the posterior openings in the thoracic wall would have been anatomically challenging. Let us consider the ritual step by step and examine these difficulties in contests. The first stage in conducting the blood eagle execution would have been to remove the skin, muscles, and shoulder blades from the victim's back. So you can see here we've got slightly shallower anatomy here, slightly deeper anatomy here. There's kind of the more superficial, the top-lying muscles are left in place, and here we can see a little bit further into the body. These structures, the skin, muscles, and shoulder blades, obscure the ribs, making it impossible to cut them while maintaining the integrity of the lungs, and subsequently preventing the manipulation of the ribs into the shape of an eagle's wings. Attempting to cut the ribs without first removing these soft tissues would have been a little like trying to saw a piece of wood with a tablecloth draped over it. Anyone with a sharp implement and experience of animal butchery, that is likely a significant percentage of the Viking Age population, would have been able to quickly remove the skin. This could have been achieved by holding a sharpened blade parallel to the underlying muscle layer and making long cutting incisions just superficial to the muscle. So if you've ever cooked a piece of meat and taken the skin off, it's exactly the same on a person. I'm told. Next, a vertical incision would need to be made, extending downwards from the base of the skull and following a line between the medial margins of the shoulder blades and the spine. So that's this long black line here. You basically cut down one on each side of the spine. This cut would sever the fibers of the trapezius, that's the largest muscle around the shoulder blade. Where are we? Here's the shoulder blade. And if the cut was deep enough, also the underlying levator scapulae muscle. So where's our levator scapulae? This one here. Though such an incision is not mentioned in extant medieval sources, it would have been necessary because if these muscles were left intact, they would have prevented the executioner from moving the shoulder blades to the side in order to expose the ribs. Essentially, they're saying your shoulder blades sit flat against your back. They want to fold them out like that so they can get to your rib cage. This would have, yeah. If this incision were continued so that it cut down to the loins, as described in Harald's saga, then the latissimus dorsi muscle in the lower part of the back would also have been cut. So we're going down to the loins, which is this word in English that means kind of the area under the rib cage, but above the hips. It would have come all the way down here and cut this massive muscle here, and that would have flopped off to the side. Once cut, however, this muscle could easily have been mobilized from the back, as is done in some breast reconstructive operations today. So if people need a breast reconstruction and there's not enough pectoral muscle, they will sometimes borrow some of the muscle from the latissimus dorsi and kind of fold it up over onto your chest, and apparently that can be made to work. So the deepest anatomical structures preventing access to the victim's lungs when approached from the rear would have been ribs, intercostal muscles, and the erectospinae muscle group. So ribs we're probably all familiar with. The intercostal muscles are the muscles that sit between the ribs. So when you get a rack of ribs, like from a pig or a cow at a restaurant, it's the intercostal muscles that you're eating. And I've lost my place again. Several of our medieval sources, Orkneyinga saga, Ragnarssonatalter, Norrgestalter, and Ormstalter, suggest that the blood eagle involved cutting the victim's ribs from the spine. Ribs all away from the spine. We note that it would have been very difficult to actually separate the ribs from the vertebrae. The joints between the ribs and the vertebrae are stabilized by several very strong ligaments, and it would have been impossible to cut all of these individually within any reasonable amount of time. Doing so while trying to maintain the viability of the ritual's victim would likely have been exceedingly difficult. Instead, the ribs would have need to have been fractured using blunt trauma. Basically, you just got to hit them till they break. Perhaps from a sword blow, as some medieval sources imply. One potential point of fracture is suggested from research which indicates the neck of the ribs, which is a point near the spine, readily breaks in instances of forced trauma. So I'm too short to reach this, but here's the neck of your ribs. And if you're in a car crash, that's often where they break. They won't break at the front, they'll break along your back. Alternatively, a short portion of the rib just lateral to the midline, the angle of the rib, is relatively narrow. So that's out here. It's also possible they would break not in close, but out here. Exactly where the ribs might have fractured in any putative blood eagle matters, because if the ribs were fractured near their angles, so further out, what remained of the ribs in situ along the spine would have obstructed access to the lungs, and there would have been far less rib cage with which to form any wings when you fold it out. So at this stage, another major complication is possible exsanguination of the victim. They can bleed to death. That's a complication. Clinical analyses of blood loss in humans indicate that it takes approximately 1.5 to 2 litres of blood, 30 to 40% of an average human adult, before an individual enters a state of confusion. Beyond this point, a person becomes lethargic and consciousness is difficult to maintain. After 2.5 litres, 50% blood loss, an individual would likely die. Anatomically, the skin and muscles of the back receive blood through several arteries, each of which would be severed when the soft tissues of the back were dissected during the initial phase of the procedure. Though none of these arteries are particularly large individually, collectively they supply a large volume of tissue, and their cutting would probably result in rapid and significant blood loss. More importantly, fracturing ribs would sever intercostal arteries. So these are these major arteries that actually run along the base of each rib. And these emerge directly from the aorta, meaning they're very high pressure, they carry a lot of blood. This would result in significant loss of blood, a dramatic fall in blood pressure, and a substantially reduced blood supply to the brain. Perhaps most significant, however, is the risk of damaging the aorta itself during the procedure. So the aorta is the major blood vessel of the body. This vessel courses from the heart down the left side. Oh, sorry, that was not the plan. This vessel courses from the heart down the left side of the thoracic vertebral column and lies immediately under where a blade would have penetrated the back during a putative blooding. Any damage to the aorta would have certainly resulted in the near immediate death of the victim. So if you're trying to keep your victim alive, you've got to do this really carefully, like weirdly carefully, considering how kind of bloody and brutal and messy this is going to be. It might also be important to mention that positioning the victim face down would have made damaging the aorta and other internal structures more likely. Having the victim prostrate on a horizontally orientated surface, that is kind of face down over a table or something, would have made dissecting the soft tissues away from the back in the earlier phase of the procedure much easier. However, using a sword or other long implement to fracture the ribs in a prone position would risk the weapon projecting directly into the body and would have required many individual blows to fracture or detach the ribs from the vertebrate column. Although the likelihood of damaging the aorta, along with the likelihood of damaging the aorta, repeated blows would also have made it highly likely that the implement would significantly damage the victim's lungs and even their heart. Essentially, this is technically really quite hard to do, given the kind of constraints that the medieval texts set upon us. At least it's hard to do and keep them viable. Another difficulty at this stage is that opening the back of the chest would have resulted in the victim's lungs collapsing due to the change in pressure differential. This collapse would have been extreme, even in comparison to cases seen in modern-day warfare. So I don't know if maybe some of the Danes have had to do military service, but I did mine, and one of the things you always have to carry with you is like a one-sided sticky plaster about the size of your hand with a one-way valve in it. And this is because if someone gets a wound in their chest, the air pressure inside the thoracic cavity is actually quite low. That's how our lungs are able to expand and contract easily. If you make a hole, suddenly the air outside rushes in and our lungs aren't strong enough to expand again. So in modern medicine, what you do is you put a one-way valve in the hole and you get the air out. Actually, in battlefield medicine, you would literally just suck the air out and worry about infection later. and that's how the lungs are able to come and go in. But if you're making a massive hole, if you're opening the thoracic cavity, the lungs just shrivel up. So there is some debate concerning how to estimate the severity of a puncture wound to the back in emergency medicine. It is certain that cutting ribs and intercostal muscles would have resulted in the collapse of both lungs. The complete lung collapse caused by opening both sides of the posterior thoracic wall would have meant that the victim would not have been able to breathe at all. Also, in cases of complete lung collapse, the actual size of the lungs themselves becomes significantly reduced, which would have made it difficult to mobilize them externally. Furthermore, severing of the arteries and nerve supply during the fracturing of the ribs would have completely disabled major muscle groups for respiratory muscles. And the spreading of the ribs to form a full blood eagle would have necessitated cutting the diaphragm away from its attachments. The diaphragm is this weird kind of flap muscle that sits at the bottom of your rib cage, and it's attached all the way around and then in the middle. So when you kind of do singing lessons or something and you have to learn to really project your voice, you're using your diaphragm to force air in and out, or at least to change pressure. So that flappy muscle needs to be cut away as well. These are somewhat academic points in terms of the possible viability of a victim, but they are important to mention since the victim would not have been able to expand or make their lungs move in any meaningful way. They would thus not have been able to scream. In the final stages of the blood eagle procedure, the executioner is said to have removed the victim's lungs through the cuts made along the spine. This would presumably have included mobilizing the ribs to some degree to allow the withdrawal of the lungs. And it is possible that the ribs were folded outwards from the victim's back, like the wings of a bird, which is where we think possibly the name might have come from. And this might, though not impossible from an anatomical perspective, there would have been significant difficulties associated with this. Firstly, the mobilization of the ribs would have been cumbersome because they act as a single unit across the back and then around the side of the body and along the anterior wall of the chest. So the whole thing is just one fixed thing, like a rack of ribs from a restaurant. This means that merely lifting the ribs at the point of their fracture at the back would have changed the shape of the victim's thorax, causing the rib cage to displace forward at the front. The ribs would therefore needed to have been fractured again near the mid-auxiliary line, so down the side here. So you've got to fracture them down the back and then down the side again. Though this could have been accomplished by physical force, it would take considerable strength and coordination, possibly more than one executioner. An anatomical difficulty would also have been the attachment of the ribs to the muscles of the lower back, particularly the serratus posterior inferior, this one here, and the diaphragm, which I've already mentioned, the big flappy one at the bottom. These muscles connect the lower ribs to the vertebrae and would have anchored the ribs from beneath, preventing them from being spread and moved as a single unit. It would thus have been necessary to sever these muscles to free the posterior part of the ribs to spread open. Lastly, removing the lungs through the openings of the back and laying them onto the spread ribs would not have been possible without first detaching the lungs from various internal structures. Leaving aside the fact that each lung would have been an entirely collapsed, compact tissue mass about the size of a fist, none of our medieval sources mention the possible removal of part of the vertebral column from the victim, which would have presented a significant physical obstacle to removing the lungs. Essentially what they said was, okay, well, you can get the lungs out, but not with the spine in the way. You've got to take a chunk of the spine out first. Alternatively, I don't think I mentioned, you can see they put on the diagram here the different points that the ribs might break. So on the left here, they've broken out further away, difficult to get in to reach the lung. And here they've been broken much closer to the spine, you've got more working room. So if you can't or don't want to remove a big chunk of the spine from the middle here so you can access stuff, well, each lung is attached internally to its primary bronchus, that's one of the two air tubes that comes up to the trachea, as well as the pulmonary veins and arteries, so a blood support system. These attachments would need to be long enough for each lung to be removed through an opening on each side of the vertebral column. However, measurements of the lengths of the right and left bronchus and pulmonary vessels indicate that this is not possible. The pulmonary arteries are about 9 centimeters in length on average, but the primary bronchi would only allow between 3 centimeters displacement of the right lung and 5 centimeters displacement of the left lung. So you couldn't pull one out without pulling the other one along with it, and that's not going anywhere because it's still tied into the blood system. The only possibility for mobilizing the lungs through an opening in the back, particularly collapsed lungs, would have been to sever their connections to the trachea, vascular system, and the heart, a maneuver which is not recorded in any medieval text. Essentially, you've got to get like a melon baller or an ice cream scoop in there and go all the way around your collapsed lung before you can pull it out. This is not quick, it's not easy, it's a mess, it's not going to work, you're going to drop stuff, there's going to be blood everywhere. This is not smooth and easy and impressive. Or maybe it's impressive, but in an uncomfortable way. So apart from the fact that there would have been no possible means for the victim to remain viable if this were to occur, the display of the remaining lungs would have been, I quote, less than spectacular. They would certainly not have kind of fluttered, as some texts seem to suggest. Lungs don't do that. It's been suggested that that's where the name comes from, right? You put the lungs out and they kind of inflate and deflate, and that makes the rib cage move. I think that's even in Midsommar, the horror film. Forget it. So so that's what the executioner or executioners would have had to manage. What about the victim? Right, we can't overlook the victim. Assuming they didn't die early on, we see two probable causes of death for a victim undergoing a bloody: exsanguination and suffocation. Both would have begun when a blade was thrust into the victim's back, and both are likely to have caused death within a matter of seconds, not minutes. Let's consider blood loss first. It's not really possible to estimate cumulative blood loss at each stage of the blood eagle procedure, but it does seem possible that an individual could have survived the initial stages when the soft tissues, the kind of skin, fat, some of the overlying muscles, were removed from their back. This assumes a quick dissection procedure that should have been possible for someone with skills in animal butchery and some knowledge of human anatomy. So possible. Significant and likely fatal blood loss would have occurred, however, the moment an instrument such as a sword was used to fracture ribs near the thoracic spine. This would have severed several major arteries, led to a significant drop in blood volume and blood pressure throughout the body, including the brain. Whether through traumatic shock or blood loss, therefore, it is highly unlikely that an individual could have remained conscious beyond the fracturing of their ribs. So you strap them down, you get the skin off, maybe they're still screaming. First blow of very, very many to come, they're out like a line, within seconds. If the aorta itself were also compromised at this stage, which is likely due to the position where an implement would have needed to penetrate the rear wall of the chest, then this would have resulted in the victim's immediate death. Now, suffocation. Once the executioner began to open the thorax, both lungs would have collapsed completely, rendering ventilation impossible. It's also important to note that all muscles that help with ventilation would have been disabled, meaning the victim couldn't even attempt to breathe. When considering the intense state of stress that a victim would have been in, the demand for oxygen would have been very high. This means that total cessation of oxygen supply from the lungs would have led to a loss of consciousness much more quickly than would be seen in a more controlled situation, such as holding one's breath in a swimming pool. It's therefore unlikely that the victim could have remained conscious for more than a few seconds after the executioner first put a sword into the chest cavity at the spine, simply due to lack of oxygen. So from our analysis, it is clear that a victim undergoing a full blood eagle would have died long before their ribs could have been formed into the shape of a bird's wings and had their lungs externalized. From an anatomical perspective, however, it would have been possible to fracture the ribs and spread them out. The complete collapse of the lungs, however, would have meant they would only have been externalized if they were completely cut free from their internal attachments. I love this final sentence. There is no possibility that a victim would have remained alive throughout the procedure. So basically, it's not happening, assuming you want them to suffer. But if you don't really care about what the victim experiences, this is very possible. It's not even that difficult. You would need a little knowledge of human anatomy. You would need some experience with animal butchery, which a lot of people in the Iron Age would have had. And you might have needed 2 or 3 people to help kind of manipulate ribs and stuff. That's not half as hard as I was expecting it to be honest with you. This study that they did brilliantly kind of pointed a few issues that don't turn up in our medieval sources. They're not excluded from our medieval sources, but have I got that right? Yeah. So it would have been what doesn't appear in our medieval sources is the fact that the victim dies or at least falls unconscious almost immediately. They gloss over that. The whole thing might be bloody and amazing and really weird and uncomfortable to watch, but this whole business of lungs being outside, that's not particularly impressive. They are dark little apple-sized things. separating the ribs out, well, that's going to need not kind of one quick blow, that's going to need multiple fractures. You see sometimes in the, I think in the Vikings TV show, they use a hatchet and they kind of go chop, 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 chop. They would needed to have done that down both sides of the spine and then down both sides of the side as well on a dead body. Not easy, not quick. The body itself is going to go shifting around. You're going to have to get somebody to lie on it to hold it still. This is weirdly involved, right? And also what the sources don't mention and what my anatomical colleagues insist would have been really helpful is just taking out that big piece of spine. Very possibly that's been done. So, in sum, anatomically, this is doable. Let's talk about whether you would actually do it, right? Because this is extreme, surely. So we've talked a lot about kind of the practicalities. Let's think a little bit more broadly. Who's doing this and why? Well, the who is actually quite nice. It's quite straightforward. These are socially powerful male elites, and they're doing it to socially powerful male elites. Our four victims are four kings, more or less. So Lyngvi Hundingsson is either a king or a war leader from the legendary times. So he crops up in Fornaldarsögur and in Eddic poetry. King Ella of Northumbria appears to have been a historical ruler of part of what is today northeastern England. Halfdan Hárleikr wasn't a king himself. He was the son of a very major king. But actually the reason he gets himself blood-eagled, if we can coin that as a verb, is because he went out to Orkney and basically kicked the Jarl of Orkney out of Orkney and installed himself as Jarl for about 3 or 4 months, I think it was, and then loses another battle and gets blood-eagled as a result. The only one who's clearly, or not clearly, a powerful political figure is Brusi, Jotun. However, in Ormsdalr, which kind of is historical in the sense that the sections that take place in Iceland seem pretty grounded and realistic and historical, as soon as Ormr and his companions go off to these distant foreign lands like Denmark, where weird, spooky stuff happens, and so it gets a lot less realistic in that sense. So Brusi is a Jotun who lives alone on an island somewhere in Norway, in the north of Norway. So in that sense, he's kind of like a ruler. He's certainly the generic equivalent of a ruler, because we've got some Fornaldarsögur type texts that deal with legendary past. We've got some more historically type texts that are still a little bit Fornaldarsögur, a little bit legendary. And then we've got Ormsdalr, which is kind of medieval fiction almost. What about the people who are doing this, who are causing a blood eagle, who are having the blood eagle done? Same thing. These are members of the male martial warrior elite. So Sigurd Hrafnsbáni, I mean, the warrior par excellence, no? The sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, big Viking war leaders. Thorfinn Jarl, ruler of the Orkneys. Briefly not, and then again. And then Ormr is, he's a kind of a semi-historical Icelandic strongman figure. He goes off to Denmark and kind of insults the foolish Danes and gets away with it. Then he goes to Norway and he wrestles trolls and stuff. He is very much a kind of a hero, even if he's not exactly kind of a Viking. We're into the 14th century literature here. But what I think we need to do, actually, is pay close attention to what happens in these texts. Because we've got these people who are having a blood eagle done. But note my grammar, because the people who are doing the blood eagle aren't necessarily the people who are having the blood eagle done. If you actually look at the text, what we've got in a few cases, we've got the person who is doing the blood eagle is the one for whom it is being done, right? So Ormr meets Brusi. He discovers that Brusi has previously tortured to death his blood brother, and so he commits a blood eagle on Brusi, right? I'm offended, I'm insulted, I've got a problem with you, I'm going to do a blood eagle to you. Same for 2 of the 4 manuscripts of Orkneyja Saga and Heimskringla. So we have here, for example, Einar Jarl went to Halfdan, handreist Abaki. It's very explicit. He did this directly. But what we find actually in more of our Old Norse sources is we find a passive construction. So Ivar, for example, Ivar and his brothers Lietu Njurister. They have it done. They cause it to be done. And actually, this matches pretty well what we know historically of Viking Age warrior elites. They didn't do anything themselves if they could avoid it. They had people for that. And so mostly what they had were warriors. So they would turn up to fight somebody and sure, they'd be involved. But most of the fighting and dying was done by the comitatus or the minibund, the kind of warrior bodyguard. But the warrior bodyguard wasn't only warriors. It also included other experts. So this is particularly clear actually when we look at toponymic evidence. So if you've looked at place name studies, what you find is you find central places that are occupied and owned by the rulers, but then the kind of satellite settlements around, well, these are rewards doled out by the rulers to particularly loyal or useful members of their comitatus. So what we find around central places with kind of hall-type names, we find warrior-type places. So there's a Karleby, for example, the warriors' settlement. We also find technical experts, particularly smiths, tend to be kind of on the edge of settlement areas where the ruler has gone, oh yeah, you've served me loyally for many years, you can have this lovely kind of cottage and farm to retire. So from this, we can actually build up a bit of a picture of who it was that the rulers are rewarding. Who have they got around them? And it's warriors, to a certain extent poets, although they tend not to get settled away. There's a little bit of a different kind of professional track record there. Technical experts, particularly smiths, and religious experts, ritual experts. And speaking of experts, if we look at those two remaining cases where we don't have the commissioner and the performer of the ritual being the same person, and we don't have a passive construction used, we have an active construction, and it's assigned to someone in particular. So let's look at Norrgestalter first. Norrgestalter, if you don't know it, is this wonderful kind of fornaldarthalter, where a 300-year-old pagan turns up at a historical Christian court and goes, I've waited so long to die until I can die in the true faith, baptize me, please. And then while the kind of baptism is going on, we get these stories of all of the legendary figures that he knew during his 3 centuries of life, including all sorts of Volsung-related stuff, so kind of Sigurður and Regin and all of these figures. And it's in that context that we get the story of the Blood Eagle. And we're told that an enemy of the Volsung or of Sigurður, he gets captured, they're going to do a Blood Eagle to him. Or actually, no, I should say that he gets captured. And then Regin the dwarf is the one who says, don't you think we should consider blood eagling him? Shouldn't we resta skildi blöðun abakan? And then in the next sentence, we're told, talk Regin. So it's Regin who suggests it and Regin who does it. There's 2 possible explanations here. Regin, if you know that the sources, is not a good character, right? He turns out to be a villain of the piece. He betrays Sigurd. So this is a literary text. Maybe this is supposed to be a comment on his character. Maybe it's a hint that, he's an untrustworthy person. Alternatively, maybe this is because he's a smith. He's got expert technical knowledge when it comes to kind of hammers and tools and making stuff. And we do know, sorry. I think I'm missing some slides there. Maybe they come up later. So let's look at then the other case where we have an expert doing stuff. And this is in the Ragnar Saga. Now, we start here. Nú skal sá maður oddhastigathar marka a baki hundum sem innliggast. And I didn't know this word oddhagastar. Now should the most point-skilled man outline an eagle on his back as precisely as possible. The language here is very kind of technical, right? You've got to do this and do it right. And I had to look up oddhagastar. I didn't know it. And it's a simple compound in the end of oddr, point, so the pointy bit of a thing, and hagur, skilled or skillful. And this is the superlative form, so it is the person most skilled with a point. And then we're told, the person who is most appropriate comes forward and does the work. I kind of looked up oddhagastar. Are there any other meanings, any other contexts we should be aware of? And interestingly, it's used in an incredibly Christian context for a bishop's saga. It's actually used to describe Margaret Haga, Margaret the Skillful, the most skillful carver of ivory and bone in Iceland. She makes a beautiful ivory crozier for the bishop. So note that this is an extremely skilled craftsperson, and they're working for the absolute cream of the crop socially. I kind of think that parallel it's not deliberate, obviously, but I think it's enlightening. We don't find the superlative form oddhagastar anywhere else that I've come across. We do know that, here's those slides I thought we were missing. We do know that in certainly pre-Christian times, there was a lot of conceptual overlap between human bodies and trees. So if you think of oddhagastar or oddhagur, kind of the more general point-skilled adjective, that can also be used of carpenters, people who work with wood. Essentially, oddhagastar seems to be an adjective that's used for people who work in bone or wood or kind of human body parts, anything kind of that's material that's malleable. And there's a big overlap there. But there's another possible explanation that might be a little bit more speculative. I do wonder if oddhagastar and this idea of the most point-skilled person in the warrior retinue might actually refer to body modification. So we have no direct evidence that Vikings did tattoos, right? But with a fair amount of circumstantial evidence that suggests it's possible. So we've got texts like in Willan that talks about how the people he meets, the Rus he meets, were covered in lines. We certainly have a lot of body lines on naked figures where we get them. That seems to be how they showed bodily structures in walls. Maybe those were painted on, maybe that's just how they showed someone was naked. And we do have a few artifacts that have been interpreted as potential tattooing needles, including this three-pointed needle here. The tattooing thing is quite speculative, but what we do know, very definitely, is that certain people in the late Iron Age filed their teeth. And I can't look at this, I have bad teeth anyway, so this gives me nightmares. But it was a thing associated with particularly elite, martially equipped graves. You find lines carved across the teeth. So they were visible. You would see that, and you'd see the lines across. And maybe they were dyed, maybe they were colourful, maybe you could smell them, I don't know. But there does seem to be some sort of implication that people in this warrior elite milieu are doing weird stuff to bodies. And maybe there's one person in the group who is like your tattoo artist or your friend who owns a piercing gun. And so when you get drunk and you want your ear done, you go to him. And you hope he's not social. So anyway, who's doing this? Well, very clearly the martial elite. Okay, happy with that. The martial elite, though, I mean, they're a bit of a culture unto themselves within the Viking Age. Frederick Sandberg has described them as a super-regional aristocratic community. Certainly from their burial kind of traditions, they did things differently to the locals everywhere. But they did things similarly to each other, no matter where they were. So there was a kind of a way of behaving, a little bit like how the kind of the super rich today all own yachts, all go to nightclubs, all drink booze, even if they're from different cultures. The international, not warrior, but the international financial elite of today act in a very similar way. So not only did they have their own forms of mortuary practice, they had their own forms of building practice. They built halls in very similar ways. They may have had their own form of language. This is a little bit controversial. They certainly had their own form of religion. And it also seems that unlike other areas in the same period, they had their own forms of violence. So there's been a fantastic study by Steve Ashby and Keith Rutter, both UK-based academics who have looked at execution and torture in the British Isles. And they said, well, look, it's all quite central. It's all quite kind of controlled. It's the king who decides what gets a beheading and what gets a hanging and so on. Comparatively in Scandinavia, you get to decide on a local level. Okay, what about the why? Because I mean, seriously? If you want someone dead, stick a knife in them, they're just as dead. Why go to all this trouble? And the traditional explanation is, of course, that this is ritual, especially religious ritual. And I've got to admit, by training, I'm a scholar of religion. I'm big into paganism. I'm fascinated by it, and I just don't buy this at all. Of our 9 sources, only one makes any explicit reference to pre-Christian religion, where Orkneyinga Saga says, oh, after the battle, blood eagle, blah, 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 and then gap han Odin til sigurs. He gave him to Odin for victory, which is what apparently some martial elite people did after a battle. They would kind of kill a lot of people and go, you're welcome, Odin, sacrifice. But only Orkneyinga Saga actually explicitly invokes this. Now, I'm not arguing that, well, I suppose I am. I'm not particularly keen on the idea of human sacrifice in the Viking Age. I think that the evidence is really ropey. Where it occurs, it does seem, or where it might have occurred, it does seem to be connected to Odin, but I think this is pretty tenuous, and I would kind of suggest that potentially Odinic human sacrifice, if it ever occurred, and a blood eagle, if it ever occurred, are not connected directly. They're both connected because they're both being done by the same people, that warrior martial elite. Now, this whole business of ritual is interesting because it's a communicative form. We might not think of it as such. We might think of ritual as just kind of doing actions without really thinking about them. But ritual, actually, the more complex a ritual is, the more bandwidth you have to communicate stuff. Even if all you're communicating is, I'm one of the people who does this ritual, therefore I belong to this group. It can be quite identitarian in that sense. So there's all sorts of bits of the blood eagle that seem really, really unnecessary, flourishes or pointless kind of difficulties that you make for yourself. Let's talk briefly about equipment. So in most of our sources where it's clear what is used, it's a sword, sverdi. I cannot think of anything worse to try and chop up a bit of a person delicately than a sword. That is the most awkward thing ever. And in fact, the only time where it's not a sword, it's never an axe or anything, the only time where it's not a sword is Ormstalter, where you didn't really have swords in that kind of context. He had a sax, so a kind of a combat knife thing. which my anatomical colleagues, like, I showed them some pictures, and I went, yeah, that'll work, which was a bit, bit disturbing. But as part of that discussion, they went, what about the one with the spear? I thought, oh God, what have I missed? You know, I've spent months doing this research. Where's the spear? And they showed me this picture. So this is a Gotlandic picture stone, which seems to show one person bending another person over some sort of object, potentially a table or a chest or a house. I mean, scale is kind of optional here. And potentially doing something with a spear held quite near the head. And I mean, yeah, you can interpret the picture stone like that. You also can interpret it lots of other ways. But I kind of showed me this. So I went, okay, well, I mean, I'm not sure about that. Would this be of any use? I mean, they're as long as a sword, some of them. And as soon as they saw these loved spears, they went, yeah, great, fantastic. That's better than a knife. Particularly if we get as far as the slightly later, slightly smaller, slightly lighter arrowhead spears. Because if you imagine the person has been bent over, and instead of just chopping away at each of those ribs individually on both sides and then up the side and up the other side, what you can do with an arrowhead spear is you can hook the barb over the top, both hands on the shaft, and rip. And that'll take it apart. And they were delighted with themselves for figuring this out, because you know, there is no in the full publication they said that there is no kind of modern medical equivalent. There's no modern medical reason to do this. We don't know how you would do it. They saw the spear. Oh, that's how. I'll be honest with you. I'm not totally convinced that this is a blood eagle at all. I think it's we can't say it's not, but I certainly wouldn't say it is. Okay, so sidebar about equipment over. But just note, actually, if you're using equipment, you might need someone who specializes in making and maintaining equipment around to help you with this, perhaps a smith. Anyway, so why do this? Sure, it's ritual, but the standing kind of interpretation was Vaterrache, father revenge. And I think this is pretty good, actually. So revenge as motivation for a blood eagle is really explicit in 3 of our sources. So Ormstalter, for example, the blood brother gets tortured to death by Brusi, and then we do a blood eagle to Brusi. It's also the context for most of the other killings. In fact, the only one where it's not clear is Knutsdrauper, this horribly short, complicated, difficult scalding burst. So, I mean, it's very possible that revenge was just implicitly understood during any potential Viking Age ideas of the blood eagle and into the medieval period. So here's Ragnarsson making that very explicit. They lintus nu kresso father there var pindir, tortured. And it's often a father, in fact. So here are the earlier, what I've called the trigger killings. Sigmundr is killed, then we get a blood eagle as a result. Ragnar Lothbrok is thrown into a pit of snakes, right, and killed, and we get a blood eagle as a result. Now, Rögnvalda Jarl is not an Orkney person. In fact, he is the father of the Earl of Orkney, Torfeinar Jarl, who had his jarldom up in Myra in northern Norway. And just for the record, what Halfdan did before sailing out to Orkney and trying to take over was sail up to Myra, lock this guy in his house and set fire to it. So it's not kind of, oh, political, I'm just going to take over these islands. It's, I don't like this family, I'm going after this dynasty, dad's dead, now let's go for the son and take his stuff. And almost after we have the fatal walk, some confused faces. This is a literary motif where if you want to kill someone, you cut open their stomach and you pull out their guts and you nail it to something, and then you make them walk around. And they pull out their own guts, and ideally they want to show some kind of Viking stoicism by continuing to walk. And if they're really Viking stoic, they'll recite some poetry as they die. This would swiftly result in death via exsanguination, it says here. Would not allow the victim to stand up and move around. So, I mean, clearly literary motive. So here's our text telling us that Torf had his father burnt in. And so what I'm pitching here is that it's not just a revenge ritual. It's kind of, these deaths aren't regular deaths. Right? People died in battle all the time. You didn't always go out after their killer looking for revenge. Sometimes you did, but not always. The blood eagle seems pretty extreme. So what I'm suggesting is that the blood eagle was conducted specifically to avenge a bad death. The idea of kind of an unpleasant or culturally inappropriate death. Like, think of what we know of the Viking Age. Kind of, it's okay to die in battle. Like, it's not great. Maybe you'll go to Valhalla, that's great. But dying in battle is a good way to die. Getting burnt in, getting thrown into a pit of snakes, less good ways to die. The fatal walk, terrible way to die. So I think what this is doing then is the blood eagle is communicating something about the commissioner but also about the victim. So about the commissioner, it's saying, hey, look, I have reclaimed my honor, I've avenged my father or my blood brother, whoever. But in doing so, the commissioner is also communicating something about the victim. Because the Iron Age martial elite only do this to each other. They don't do it to poor people. They don't do it to women. They don't do it to people who've been enslaved. They only do it to other powerful male elites. And in fact, during the Blood Eagle, depending on how you react to it, it's possible to kind of communicate something about yourself. So Lingvi, for example, well, han dog med mycket triste. He died with great valor in an appropriate way, as opposed to Brusi, who ska livsitt med littlum drengskap, with very little manhood. This is Alsbjorn. This is the guy who did the Fatal Walk. He actually recites a whole poem that is like half of Wormsdalter. Is this huge long poem he recites while getting his guts pulled down. And I want to just touch on this idea of Viking Stoicism again. Right, there are good and bad ways to behave, even as you're dying. Get ideas of this in Halvormar. So this is a ritual that is incredibly communicative. It's saying something about who I am as the commissioner, who you are as the victim, and also about the other people who are taking part. And this idea of kind of conspicuous construction, spectacular death, is something we get a lot, particularly with the martial elites in the Iron Age. We know that when there was a dynastic shift, so like there's been 4 or 5 generations of the same family ruling an area, and then a new family takes over, they don't move into the same hall, or they don't rebuild the hall in the same place. They burn the old one down, they smash the glass, they throw the treasures in the fire, they let the whole thing collapse, and they build a new hall 100 meters that way. So it's the same place, but it's not the same house, as it were. So there is this kind of performative element of redressing a perceived social imbalance. Well, I've talked a lot around going, well, look, really? This isn't setting fire to a house. This is bloody and brutal and messy and horrible, and you're making all sorts of people be involved. Isn't this too extreme even for the Viking Age? And I don't know. I don't think it is necessarily. We have some evidence that the practice of suttee was performed in the late Iron Age. So this is when a man dies, a woman either dies or perhaps commits suicide, I think more likely is killed in most cases, in order to accompany him into death or the other world. This turns up in the Risala, turns up in Gylfaginning. We also have a significant amount of high-end graves from Sweden that might reflect the same idea, where we've opposite-sex pairs. We also have a lot of conspicuous display of post-mortem bodies. You've killed somebody and you show off their body. So hanging bodies in robes or leaving them lying around on the battlefield. We also have it with animals, so religious ritual. This is Al-Tartushi. This is the Spanish guy of Jewish extraction who travelled around Europe and then came home and wrote a report about his travels in Arabic. In 961, I think it is, he gets to Hilleby, so what was then Denmark, meets the Danes, and he describes their religious rituals. He says, anyone who slaughters an animal puts up poles at the door to his home and impales the animal upon them so that his neighbours know that he is sacrificing to his God. Right, you don't just do stuff in the Viking Age unless someone sees it. Same, think of Kristni Saga, the description of how everyone converted in Iceland, right? You could do paganism online, in private, in secret, if no one brings witnesses against you, you can do it. But I mean, if no one sees you do something, have you really done it? There seems to be kind of a different attitude here. Also, speaking of animals' heads on sticks, Neathstone, of course, the idea of putting a cursed pole with a horse's head on and putting it out to be seen. We also might have some evidence in the deviant burial corpus. So deviant burials are this archaeological category that you have graves that differ from local norms. Now, this is super hard in the Viking Age because we don't have large local norms, like almost every region is doing it differently, but there are some that stand out. So if we look just locally here at Borøya in Langeland, we've got grave P, where we've got a guy who's like face down, he's got stones on top of him and a knife driven into the ground. That's kind of weird. Why that? Is this like an anti-zombie thing? An anti-revenant activity? We also have, from the same same cemetery, grave T, a woman who was first of all buried in a wooden cyst, and then after she's skeletonized, so kind of 7, 8 months at least, she's been in the ground. They dig her back up and behead her and then bury her again. Right? That's not normal. There's something kind of weird going. So people did do weird stuff with graves sometimes, with outliers, with special cases. And I want to talk briefly about Bjerken 959, where we've got a very richly furnished female grave. where the inhabitant has been beheaded. But there's also something a bit weird going on beyond the beheading. Now, beheading is, of course, a rich, bloody spectacle of an execution, even if it's fairly quick compared to a bloody. What's interesting about this grave in particular isn't just the fact that she was executed in a horrible way, but then still buried with all of her beautiful amulets and personal possessions, a very wealthy grave, kind of confirming that she belongs to the elite even after she's been punished in some way, or at least kind of bloodily killed. She was beheaded and her jaw is gone. So maybe the axe kind of didn't get her here, maybe it got her here and it literally destroyed the jaw. Maybe something else was done with the jaw. We don't know. But what we do know is when she was buried, a jaw was provided for her. She was given a pig's mandible. Now, it's possible that was some sort of bone used for something else. Maybe it was just kind of significant. Maybe it was kind of symbolic. Maybe she was literally given a pig's face. Like that would, if you'd taken the lower half of a pig's face, still with the meat and the snout and everything, and put it in, that's what you'd have left. And if she's missing part of her own face, did they like give her half a pig's face? But still bury her with all of her jewelry and all of her beautiful things. For us, that might seem kind of a little counterintuitive, a little contradictory. Not so in the Viking Age. So I kind of argue that, well, the blood eagle represents some of these same ideas, or reflects some of these same ideas. So is the blood eagle extreme? Yeah, no question. Does it seem unreasonably extreme compared to a lot of other stuff we're seeing in this culture? I don't think it's unreasonably so. So let's revisit this question. Could the blood eagle have been performed during the Viking Age? Yeah. Like, we have found nothing that says it couldn't have. We found no stumbling blocks that would have prevented you doing even the most extreme, full version of the blood eagle. Does that mean the blood eagle was performed in the Viking Age? No, I'm not claiming that. We're not claiming that. We're just saying that, well, we can't find anything to disprove it. So thank you for your attention. I'll stop there.
Any questions?
Horrified silence, probably. when can we get this going out of here?
Why is the blood eagle the more popular, like, Viking iconography? Like, why not the hung meat or like the tree walk in terms of other Viking decks?
I'd say two reasons. One is because it's uniquely kind of Viking. So the tree walk, the fatal walk, or the tying someone to a tree, shooting them full of arrows, those are literally hagiographical motifs. So they come first from France in Latin manuscripts, they move to the British Isles, they get turned into vernacular, and that's probably how we end up with them making their way up to Scandinavia. Or maybe they came directly through the church. But that's kind of less explicitly Viking in that sense. So I think the blood eagle is particularly useful for medieval writers who are keen to kind of stress the otherness of the pagan past. That's my take. But we don't have a firm answer. Yeah, that's what I think.
Nice, thanks.
Come.
Just wondering, in the follow-up to that, and we mentioned about textual evidence, some of these blood eagles that are described in the text actually teach me from the British Isles. Is there any foreign mention of this blood that you know of?
No, I actually looked quite carefully. So King Ella of Northumbria, his death is recorded in all sorts of places, different chronicles, sources in both Old English and in Latin from the British Isles. They're all very terse. He's not a very big or important king. He's basically a petty jarl or something. But we're told either he dies in battle or he dies as a result of the invasion. The blood eagle is never mentioned. And I kind of thought, oh, is that kind of proof against the blood eagle? But these descriptions of his death are so short. It's like 4 or 5 words that I can't help thinking that in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, for example, which has no details of anything, for the writer of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, died in battle is functionally the same as lost a battle, got captured, got tortured to death, died. That's my take on it. No, there is no external evidence for this. Doesn't mean none will turn up. We have no direct archaeological evidence for this. It would be lovely if we found a skeleton, right, with kind of breaks down the ribs and ribs fall out. Nothing yet. But what Leszek Kardera, who's an archaeologist who worked a lot with deviant burials in Scandinavia, has said is a lot of the deviance is lost to us. It's what he calls invisible deviance, because maybe it's burying someone naked instead of in clothing, or it's doing something onto their body, to their meat, as it were. Well, that's not going to show up on a skeleton. So if we did have any superficial blood eagles just carving into the skin and salting the wounds, that's not going to show up in the archaeological record. And of course, it's entirely possible a full blood eagle skeleton will turn up tomorrow. Archaeology is growing all the time. We can only hope, right? But we might never find a blood eagle, even if it really did happen, even if it happened more than these 3 times, right? Even if it happened every couple of years, we might never find archaeological evidence for it.
Sorry,
Please do.
follow-up archaeological question. Because Karen talked about this in her class, and we talked about the dead Viking cosmology. With Revenant and their fear of like the dead coming back, what would they have done for these deviant deaths to like prevent that? Do we have archaeological evidence?
Yeah. So is it grade P or D? It's your man here who's stuck. Stones on him, and objects point down. Seem to be something to kind of pin them in place, both kind of physically, and it's entirely possible he was wearing up through a trouser leg or something. But Lejek Ardeva, his name is here. He's written books on this. It's great. Check it out. He's also responsible for these fantastic reconstructions. He's also a really nice bloke. If you email him and tell him I told you, he'll send you stuff. Anyone else?
It might be a little bit philosophical about what death is, but in terms of like the medical analysis, we know that the body can still sometimes move after death.
Yeah.
Is there any possibility that when we discuss someone still being alive throughout the entire process, while they're about to be unlikely, that there is some deeper analysis of like what death is to the Vikings? That if the body still moves, that still means that the victim is alive.
Totally. I think you've hit on something spot on that we touch on in the full publication, but didn't really have time to go into, is that death is a cultural construction, right? If I have a heart attack and my heart stops beating, some cultures would regard me as dead. Thankfully, our culture would throw me in an ambulance and give me a heart starter and stuff, and I might wake up 10 minutes later, maybe brain damage, maybe not, but I'd wake up, I wouldn't have died. Or maybe I could say, oh, I died for a few minutes, but I'm better now. Right? If you go in a time machine and go back even 50 years, they'd be like, what? That makes no sense, you're a revenant. So death is a cultural construction, as is life, and it's entirely possible that, yeah, if the body is twitching, maybe they're still alive. But actually, none of our sources ever say they were alive during it. That seems to be kind of later legend building or kind of elaboration, especially bloody Victorians. So the 19th century gentleman scholars loved this idea of blood eagling people. It is everywhere. If you're interested in that, there's references in a footnote in the full article. But they were well into this kind of bloody description stuff. And it's from there that our modern Western culture, even internationally, gets a lot of the details. It's from these English gentleman scholars who didn't know what they were talking about. At the back. There might be, but if it is, it's been lost to time. So what we do know about this Viking Age martial elite is they liked carrion animals. They liked wolves, they liked ravens, and they liked eagles. If we're making something kind of bird-shaped, if that is actually where the name comes from, I would actually count the fact that they used eagle instead of raven as yet more evidence that this isn't a very Odinic ritual. I don't think this is connected to Odin cult, except perhaps tangentially that some people who are doing this type of thing are also in Odin cults. But I mean, that's negative evidence and it's super flimsy, so I haven't written that down anywhere. But no, as for why an eagle as opposed to a seagull or something, no idea. No. Yeah. I've never heard someone giggle at the words instrumentation. You've taught them well, Khan. Yep. Yep. Right, yeah, yeah.
But is using animals as something to torture?
No. The simple answer is no, which is why I don't think it was supposed to be understood as kind of they used an eagle to kill him. It was more they killed him and an eagle happened to feed on his back Where are we? Have I gone too far? I don't want to deprive you of your instrumental data.